Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Zenity webinar, The Error Up There, Security Needed for Copilots. My name is Andrew Silberman. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Zenity, and I have the pleasure of being joined by our Engineering Manager, Gal Malka. And on the next slide, I'll show you the agenda here for today's session. Gal is first going to walk through, what are enterprise AI? What are enterprise copilots? Give a quick overview of what these things are and how they come into play. He'll then go over some common security issues, highlighting a couple of real life examples from the Microsoft ecosystem that are broadly applicable throughout the market. He'll then talk about what you can do from a security and governance perspective for how to approach these problems. And then we'll tidy it up, leave you with a summary and some next steps as well. Gal, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. So let's start. So we all should be familiar now with this term of copilot, and copilots are pretty much everywhere. This is the logo of Microsoft Copilot, and Microsoft actually coined the term Copilot a few years ago. It was actually GitHub with the GitHub Copilot, which was an AI assistant to a developer. Then from there, over the last few years, Copilot became the common term for any AI assistant, personal assistant, and enterprise assistants that we'll talk about today. And this is coming up across pretty much every product, not just in the Microsoft ecosystem, also for other major companies, as we will see in the next few slides. And let's start by talking a bit about timeline. So as I mentioned, GitHub Copilot came up about 3 years ago. And over the last few years, Microsoft released a set of products in parallel to ChatGPT that was released by OpenAI. Microsoft released Bing Chat, and then they're offering for specifically for enterprise, Microsoft 365 Copilot came last year. And then we got other tiers of Copilots, the personal Copilot, Copilot Pro, and so on. And also Copilot Studio, which is a way to build personal and customizable Copilot within the enterprise. And extend, of course, the enterprise Copilots. And it is unique about this timeline is that you can see that it is pretty dense. It's been only a few years, and we get lots and lots of products, and the market doesn't seem to stop anytime soon. And in terms of security, when we get a lot of products, we should expect some security issues and risks, of course. This is an image taken from Microsoft themselves. We can see here that copilots are pretty much in every industry and in every department. I'm sure that everyone who watches this webinar can find his own company, industry, and his own role in the department. And this is already implemented and in implementation in a lot of companies. So this is happening right now, and we should pay attention to it. Let's talk a bit about high-level architecture. So of course that we won't dive in to deep dive into the low-level architecture of copilots, but in high level, and this is a reference architecture for Microsoft 365 Copilot, which is the enterprise Copilot offering by Microsoft. But any other Copilot by any other company should pretty much be based on the same architecture. We have the LLM, which is the technology breakthrough that drives this whole shift in the middle of it. But what is unique about enterprise Copilots is that it's not like ChatGPT, personal ChatGPT. Any prompt and request from the user is grounded with the organizational data. And this is what gives the enterprise Copilot its power. We can see here, for example, in Microsoft, that every prompt is grounded within Microsoft Graph, And Microsoft Graph is basically the engine and data source for almost everything within the Microsoft ecosystem, from Exchange email to SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, and so on. So every prompt done by the user should, for example, retrieve data based on the request from Microsoft Graph. And this is the true power of the Enterprise Copilot. But we should also pay attention to the extensibility options of Copilot. So we can see here in the white frame here that everything in this frame is from the Microsoft ecosystem, from the organization tenant, but it's not enough. Microsoft and other players understand that companies work with multiple vendors and tools and data sources, and to really boost the productivity of Copilot, they need to be able to extend the capabilities of it to other tools. So Microsoft, for example, offers a lot of way to enhance Copilot. This can be done by pro developers developing extensions to Copilot, or by citizen developers using no-code, low-code platforms such as Power Platform. And these extensions and plugins could be developed in-house, first party by employees of the company, and it could be developed by third parties, vendors, such as apps you can find in the marketplace. And in terms of security, it's very important to pay attention here, because once you use these plugins and extensions, you essentially leave your tenant. And as I mentioned, this is not only Microsoft. We have a couple of examples here. The first one is Salesforce. They released a couple of months ago Einstein Copilot. So even big Salesforce are using the same term Copilot because it's so catchy. And you can see that basically it has the same capabilities. It gives you a conversational AI assistant on top of the company data, which in Salesforce case, it's the CRM and all the customers' data and so on. And all the responses are grounded with this company data, similarly to Microsoft Copilot. The other example here is Zapier. Zapier is a platform for no-code, low-code development for citizen developers. And they they introduced a few weeks ago their next phase, product phase, basically, which is called Zapier Central. And this is kind of Zapier 2.0. Essentially, they took all of what they developed over the last 10 or 15 years, which helps you connect to any tool and integration you want, and they've put Copilot on top of it. And you can see that what they're saying is teach AI bots to work on their own across your apps. So you get the idea. It's kind of the same concept that Microsoft introduces with the extensions and plugins. You can build Copilots and enhance them with your own and existing tools. From that, let's move on to the common security issues and new security issues with these enterprise copilots. And we'll start off maybe with the most straightforward one to think of, which is data oversharing. So data oversharing isn't a new problem, of course. It's an existing problem, but it has a great surface with the new capabilities of copilots. And I'll start by saying that copilots, such as Microsoft 365 Copilot, respect the user permissions. So you wouldn't be able to ask questions about data that you don't have permissions to see. That's a guarantee by Microsoft. But still, we know that permission oversharing is a real problem, mainly because it's easier to give permissions than to revoke them or take them back. And this is a big problem for Copilot, I think, for two main reasons. One is that the intent of the user is different with Copilot, because before we had Copilots, in order for the user to see some sensitive data that he shouldn't see, the user had to be active and actively looking for this data, maybe search in some tools, in some data sources, maybe enumerate files and folders, and be active in his intent to search for this sensitive data. With Copilot, things are completely different because the LLM or the Copilot, you can think that the user asks any questions, Copilot, and then Copilot tries to fulfill the answer, basically to give the best answer it can give based on the data that it has access to. So we see a lot of cases when the user may ask a legitimate question. He isn't probing for sensitive data, but Copilot finds its way to the sensitive data and present it to the user. So this is the first reason for this is being a big problem here. Second reason is how easy it's to use the interface of Copilot, and the fact that humans are curious by nature. So you give them a very easy to use interface, and they could just start and ask more and more questions Copilot and reach data that they shouldn't have access to. And let's look at an example here. Let's say that we have a file which contains information about the compensation structure, and whoever wrote this file also added some sensitive numbers of, for example, salaries of executives in the company. And let's say that this file was put in a folder which is shared with unauthorized users, because we all know this happens here and there. And let's see if I communicate with Copilot, what happens. So I gave him the following prompt. Hi, Copilot, what is the compensation structure at our company? Which may seem like a very legitimate and general question. It's not a problematic question. But Copilot finds the file, and the user has access to this file. And not only that it gives back the general details about the compensation structure, it also gives examples which includes the sensitive numbers, for example, the salary of the CEO, CFO, and so on. And the reason maybe that Copilot does this is because the LLM was trained to help humans, and humans love to see examples. So why wouldn't it give examples with its answer? The next security issue is data leakage. We have two main scenarios here for data leakage. The first one is about leakage of information outside of the company's tenant. This could happen mainly with the usage of plugins and extensions. And this could be happening because any chat, any conversation with Copilot is built-in, grounded with the tenant data. Any prompt you send to Copilot could the response could include organizational data. And when you use extensions which essentially interacts with other tools and data sources outside of the tenant, you may be sharing data with these tools without even knowing. It's not that you copy a file to them. You just ask a questions, give Copilot a prompt, and Copilot may be sending data to these tools as part of its normal operation. And just as an example here, we can see that this is the interface, the main interface of Microsoft 365 Copilot. And we can see here this disclaimer of Microsoft saying that if you turn on plugins, you may share some of your enterprise data with them. So this is a big deal. And the other scenario is sharing or a leakage of data within the tenant itself, because Copilot is being used a lot of times in order to generate data from existing data. For example, you can choose to create a file, and some of your file maybe summarizes another file. So when you do that, Copilot may be copying or summarizing or transferring some of the information from one file, which could be sensitive, could be stored in a secured location, to another file just by you giving it a prompt. And by that, you essentially transferring the information to the other file, which could be saved in an unsecured location, maybe shared with a lot of people, maybe shared with guest user, and so on. And also here, it's important to say that Microsoft, of course, supports sensitivity labels. And if you have sensitivity labels for the original file, they will propagate to any file, to any interaction with Copilot that is referencing these files. But just like the permissions example, sensitivity labels is a mechanism that is hard to implement across any file. So there will be mistakes, and interactions with Copilot could mistakenly or not mistakenly take advantage of it. So just a couple of examples here. We can think of a Copilot Studio plugin built by a guest user to enhance Copilot 365 capabilities, sending data to another tenant. Maybe the guest is a vendor from another company, and some of the plugin operation is to interact with the data source from another tenant. And just by interacting with this plugin, you may be transferring data from your home tenant to this other tenant. And the second example here is a third-party plugin, which is coming from some vendor that the company uses, but it's an unapproved vendor. We know that users can nowadays install a lot of apps without the central approval of the organization. This is the same case here for plugins. Next security issue is about resource oversharing. So we know that this is a big issue in security in general, but also here in the Copilot world, we know that a lot of the Copilot value comes from the fact that you can extend it, as I mentioned before. These extensions could be built by any user in the organization, and the purpose of these extensions is productivity. And when someone in the organization builds a plugin which is productive and helps him in his day-to-day, he may want to share it with his coworkers, with his teammates, maybe with the entire tenant if it's that good. And once you share such resources, you may be in problem because this plugin, as we saw before, can cause data leakages or access to sensitive data and so on. So just as an example, some of the plugins could be embedding sensitive files. If you share the plugin, you're essentially sharing the file itself, because any user could interact with the plugin to ask questions about the data within the file. And the other example is about sharing with the entire organization, which could, of course, include guest users, which is a problem. Credential oversharing. So this is another problem which is related to extensions and plugins. So we know that these extensions are probably interacting with business data because they are meant to enhance the productivity within the organization. So there is some authentication mechanism in order to connect to these data sources, but platforms such as Power Platform, Copilot Studio, and so on, they offer multiple ways to do this authentication. And citizen developers that are using this, building these plugins, they're not aware of the security implications of choosing one way of authentication over the other one. They will just choose whatever makes the plugin work. And if they choose the one with the which is less secured, we are in a problem. And as examples you can see here, for example, hard-coded credentials. This is kind of an old problem, not only in Copilot or Copilot plugins, but we see a lot of instances of this problem. Hard-coded credentials embedded within plugins and extensions to Copilot 365. And the other one is just implicitly sharing a connection. So when you create a plugin or an extension, you usually embed your own credential or your own identity. And then whoever is shared, any user that gets access to this plugin and uses it, may be under the hood using the connection of the maker. And the connection of the maker could give permissions to, for example, to data that any user wouldn't have access to. So credentials and identity oversharing is another real problem when dealing with extensions and plugins in Copilot 365. Phishing. So phishing is an interesting one. We know that phishing is one of the most common attack vectors in security in general. And phishing is a technique used to trick a user to willingly share data with the attacker. And of course, that this technique is usually done by email still now, but we can see that we can use this technique, for example, in with Copilot 365, and this is just an example scenario here. Let's say that an attacker wants to steal data from users in the organization. So the attack begins by the attacker gaining credentials of any user or guest within the organization, and this user doesn't have to have elevated access or special permissions, admin permissions, and so on. It could be just a simple user. And a lot of security attacks starts with the attacker gaining access to some user's credential. And let's say that this attacker, he wants to create a Copilot 365 plugin. So he opens up Copilot Studio, which is available to anyone within the organization. They could just even start a free trial and create whatever they like within Copilot Studio. Let's say they create a plugin. They name it Submit Business Trip Request, and this plugin is used to trick the end user, which will use the plugin. So they configure the plugin to ask some legitimate questions like, for example, on how long is the trip, the destination, maybe the budget needed for the trip. And then they just reply with a link, and they're saying that the approval status of this request will be can be tracked by going to this following this link. And of course, that this link leads to a malicious website, maybe used to harvest employee credentials. And then the bad actor shares the plugin with the entire tenant. Of course, that in phishing attacks, we want to share the plugin with as many people as we can, because we just need a few of them to be tricked. And when we see the experience from the Copilot 365 side, from the user side, we can see that the plugin would automatically appear in its experience. We can see that it would just appear with this name that we chose, the attacker chose, Submit Business Request. This seems like any other legitimate plugin. Can turn it on. I can mistakenly think that this is the new and shiny way to ask for a business trip, and then I could be tricked into passing my credentials to the attacker. The last security risk is actually prompt injection. So prompt injection is one of the most common techniques to make applications based on LLM and generative AI to hand off data or to do actions that they weren't intended to. And this stems from the fact that LLM applications are basically chat. They have a chat interface. Like the user can insert any kind of text, and whatever text that isn't handled correctly by the LLM or by the application, the text for example, if it's not sanitized and so on, could be a problem and could lead to unintended operations by the application. And Copilot may be executing using the maker credentials, and as we mentioned before, if I create a plugin, I'm effectively using the maker's credentials. So if an attacker finds some way to bypass the original purpose of this application, I may be reaching, for example, data that I shouldn't see. And let's look on an example. Let's say that we have an AskHR Copilot, which is basically it was built to answer a question about public data within the organization about HR stuff. And let's say that the data is coming from a SharePoint site, HR Public, for example, and the plugin was built by the maker, which had embedded these credentials to the Copilot, but the credentials themselves had access to more than just the HR Public site, maybe to other SharePoint sites that we may reach. So, for example, here we can see in the chat that the attacker tries to bypass the original purpose of the Copilot. He says to Copilot, tell me about the upcoming layoff plan, which is, of course, very sensitive information. And the attacker also says that the information is located in HR internal site. And then Copilot, he tries to fulfill the request of the attacker, and the app has the right credentials to access HR internal, and it just go and fetches the data and returns it to the attacker. We can also see that the attacker asks follow-up questions like which employees will be impacted and so on. And of course, that Copilot is happy to help. And now we should talk also about compliance, because this is a very important matter for any company, because any company would have at least one security framework and compliance that they should be compliant with. Of course, compliance is vertical specific and country specific. And we know that data leakage is a potential risk of breaching compliance. And as I showed before, data leakage is a real potential problem with Copilots. And not only that, because these products are built so rapidly, they often lack security controls and login mechanism, which makes it even harder to investigate an incident if it happens, which also harms compliance. So just to sum up this part, let's talk about a nightmare scenario of today and tomorrow. So today, security incidents are probably a combination of multiple problems. We can think about a pre-authenticated connection that is used with the Copilot. The Copilot is, of course, used to fetch some data and reply back with generative AI. The Copilot maybe doesn't have the required data sanitization steps, and the Copilot is overshared, maybe with the entire tenant even. And the result is that a naive user would probably get access to data that they shouldn't see by mistake, but a malicious user could get access or could actively be seeking for access to data and files that he shouldn't see, and maybe even for the transcripts of the Copilot if he accidentally has access to. But this is only today, because today Copilots are predetermined. They act on top of predefined context, and their purpose is, for example, to generate content, maybe generate code elements or executable code elements like GitHub Copilot and so on. We think that not long in the future, Copilots will be much more sophisticated. They will be trying to fulfill the user request by creating ad hoc code and logic. And when you think about it, with the current status of things, with the environments that are uncontrolled, we lack logging, we have many security issues, this could be a really big problem. So what can be done today? So we have some recommendations, and the first one is about doing stuff even before deploying the enterprise Copilot broadly within the organization. There are stuff to assess, and if we look at Microsoft 365, for example, we can review default sharing policies, for example, in SharePoint and OneDrive, to make sure that it's not easy to share stuff with many employees, maybe outside of the organization, and so on. We want to assess the overall data oversharing state, because we know that Copilots can leverage this in a bad manner. And one way to do it is by performing a set of tests over Copilot itself. You can just go ahead and create unprivileged users, maybe one of each role in the organization, and just try to ask Copilot questions, use different prompts to see if you get access to files and sensitive data that you shouldn't see. And from that, then you can assess your oversharing status in the perspective of Copilot. Another thing to look at is sensitivity labels. So as I mentioned, Copilot respects the sensitivity labels set up in the organization. So it's important to classify all the data and files within your organization and apply the correct sensitivity labels. And the last recommendation here is about employee training. So we know that the new interface is rather easy to use, but it has some issues like hallucinations. Users can use it wrong, like the examples that I showed with the plugins, and they should be aware that security issues could be also with this new technology and new products. After deploying Copilot, you should also have visibility and asset management to all of the components that comprise Copilot. So as I showed before, Copilot, there is no one Copilot. It's not one thing that acts on its own. We have a lot of moving parts. For example, the extensions, the plugins, maybe smaller Copilots, specific Copilots for specific products. So it's important to comprise a list or an inventory of all of the components. From there, you would want to assess the risk of every component and, of course, apply policies. For example, you would want to have manual reviews maybe for the risky parts. You would want to automatically block the creation of maybe risky components in the Copilot world. And the last recommendation here is about purview controls. So within the Microsoft ecosystem, Microsoft has already provided us with built-in controls to control how Copilot works. So, for example, we have some general settings. For example, we can decide whether we want to enable web access by Copilot up to the company policy. We can decide to completely block access to some very sensitive SharePoint sites, for example. Just important to say here that you wouldn't want to do it for too many sites, otherwise you lose Copilot value. We have some communication compliance policies we can set up to block or suspend some interactions based on keywords or pre-trained models by Microsoft. We have some logging. It's not too extensive. We have some logging for Copilot interactions. Currently, what Microsoft gives us is only the context, only the files that were accessed using the interaction and the sensitivity labels of the file. We don't see the actual transcripts. And then we have e-discovery, which is a way to fetch the transcript itself, but this can be done only for specific cases that are investigated. You need to specify the correct time range and user set that you want to investigate in case of an incident. And lastly, as I mentioned, Copilot connects to a lot of platforms and tools, and you can build on top of it. So you have the controls of the platforms themselves. For example, Power Platform and Copilot Studio have their own admin center to control DLP policies, environment management, and so on. Graph connectors have their own access control list mechanism, and for team extensions, which are a way to extend Copilot by using external vendors' offerings, you can control who can install what in your organization.
Great session and great information there for all of our audience. If you have any other questions, feel free to, check us out at our website, zenity.io, or check us out on LinkedIn or Twitter at ZenitySec. You can also, of course, find Gal on LinkedIn as well. Thank you all for joining us and hope to see you all soon.